Picture this. You're sitting with her, the woman you care about more than you'll ever admit out loud. You've opened up to her. You've told her the fears you've never let see daylight, the dreams you rarely speak, the parts of you that only emerge when you finally trust someone. For the first time in a long time, you feel safe enough to show your heart. And just when you think this moment should pull her closer, she pulls away. Her texts soften into one-word replies. Her tone shifts. Her presence fades. Her energy retreats like she's quietly stepping out of the world you thought you were building together. It feels like betrayal. Because you were taught that vulnerability builds connection. You believed that if you loved harder, she'd love deeper. But what I'm about to tell you is the part no one warns men about. There's a moment, silent, invisible, almost imperceptible, when you become emotionally dangerous to a woman. And it has nothing to do with anger, dominance, or cruelty. It happens the moment you stop needing her. 1. The biological truth. Most men never realize this. Women aren't drawn to your emotional openness. They're drawn to your emotional stability. There's a difference. Women don't want a man who collapses when he feels something. They want a man who can feel deeply and still remain centered, composed, grounded. That response is hardwired into their biology, a psychological mechanism shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. In ancient environments, a woman's survival depended on reading a man's emotional state, not his words, not his promises, his stability. A man who was volatile, needy, or dependent was a liability, unpredictable, unreliable, dangerous in the wrong way. But a man who could regulate himself, a man who didn't crumble under stress, a man who could detach from emotion long enough to act with clarity, that man signaled something far more powerful than love. He signaled safety. And here's the irony. In modern relationships, the moment you show her that you don't need emotional reassurance, that you don't need her validation to stay balanced, that your world doesn't orbit around her mood, that same ancient biological system activates. Inside her mind, a quiet recognition appears. This man stands on his own. This man cannot be emotionally controlled. This man is sovereign. This is why men who cling get ignored, and men who stand firm get noticed. Biology has not modernized. It has not evolved with smartphones, social media, or relationship trends. Women are still wired to follow the man who remains emotionally centered, not emotionally exposed. And brother, the moment you shift from dependence to sovereignty, she feels it instantly. 2. The mechanism, how it actually works. There's a psychological mechanism underneath all of this, a system running quietly in the background of every modern relationship. Women operate through emotional feedback loops. Your reactions, your tone, your jealousy, your excitement, your disappointment. Every emotional output you give becomes data. Data she reads, data she interprets, data she uses to understand where she stands in your world. When you respond instantly to her messages, she knows she has access. When you show jealousy, she knows she can influence you. When you get upset easily, she knows she can redirect your emotional state. This feedback loop releases dopamine in her brain, a subtle reward system confirming she still matters, still has influence, still holds emotional gravity in your life. But when you break that loop, everything changes. The moment you stop reacting emotionally, her brain loses its usual predictability. You reply when you want to, not when your anxiety demands it. You speak calmly instead of exploding. You don't chase reassurance. You don't spiral when she pulls away. You don't explain yourself every time she changes tone. Your emotional world becomes harder to access, harder to read, harder to influence. Her brain senses a shift. I can't control this man's emotional temperature anymore. I don't know where he stands. Why isn't he responding the way he used to? This creates psychological tension, the same tension that drives desire, attraction, and pursuit. Because the male brain is soothed by predictability, but the female brain is activated by uncertainty. Not chaos, uncertainty. There's a difference. Chaos destroys connection. Uncertainty fuels attraction. When you become emotionally stable, detached, sovereign, you introduce a level of unpredictability she didn't prepare for. Not because you're playing games, but because you're no longer emotionally dependent. The more she can't read your emotional world, the more her instincts push her to pursue clarity, connection, and confirmation.
This is why emotionally independent men are labeled dangerous, not because they harm women, but because they disrupt women's emotional patterns. And once that mechanism triggers, the entire relationship dynamic shifts. 3. The warning signs she feels the shift. Here's how you know she has sensed the change. That moment when your emotional sovereignty breaks the old dynamic. These signs aren't random. They're patterned, predictable, and almost universal. 1. She becomes hyper-aware of your silence. You don't reply as fast. Not because you're playing games, but because your mind is finally occupied with your own life. Suddenly her messages come quicker. She double texts. She checks in more often. Her brain is trying to restore the old feedback loop. 2. She gets louder when you get calmer. Before, she could spark a reaction, frustration, anger, fear of losing her. Now, when she tries to provoke emotion and you remain composed, she escalates. Because emotional reactions used to give her data, now she feels blind. 3. She starts asking indirect questions. Why are you so quiet lately? Are you losing interest? Is something wrong? Do you even care? She's not looking for answers. She's looking for emotional calibration. She wants to know if she still has access to your inner world. 4. She initiates more. More touch, more calls, more subtle intimacy, more just checking on you. A woman only chases equilibrium when she feels it slipping. 5. She tests your emotional grounding. Texts you at odd hours, acts distant to see if you panic, throws small jabs to check your reaction, brings up your past mistakes, suddenly gets moody without explanation. These aren't signs of immaturity. These are diagnostics, ways to measure your emotional stability under pressure. Because every woman, consciously or not, wants to know, if life collapses, can this man stay steady? 3 case studies that reveal the pattern. Case study A, the man who stopped overgiving. He pulled back emotionally because he realized he was chasing. Within days, her energy flipped, from distant to affectionate, from cold to curious. She didn't miss him. She missed the emotional power she once had. Case study B, the man who got focused. He wasn't trying to ignore her. He simply got absorbed in his mission again. Work, training, purpose. Her response? Sudden anxiety, sudden clinginess, sudden "what's wrong" messages. Because when a man's focus shifts, a woman's instincts activate. Case study C, the man who stopped explaining himself. He stopped justifying every decision. He became firm, concise, non-reactive. Her reaction? A mix of frustration and attraction. She felt the emotional walls rise, not shutting her out, but protecting his center. And here's the truth. Every woman feels it when a man steps into emotional sovereignty. Every woman reacts, and no woman can ignore it. 5. The social conspiracy. How society manipulates men into staying weak, predictable, and emotionally harmless. They won't tell you this openly, but the world prefers men who are tame, predictable, emotionally obedient. Men who never become dangerous, especially to women. Because a man who understands female psychology, a man who sees through emotional manipulation, a man who doesn't break when he's ignored, tested, or replaced, cannot be controlled. So society trains you from childhood to do the opposite. You're told to be nice, to never upset her, to do everything right so she stays. But behind those soft, cozy instructions hides a brutal truth. The world teaches men to behave in ways that women don't respect, so that the world can keep you compliant, anxious, and easily exploited. Think about it. Movies portray the good guy who sacrifices everything for love, while the woman magically realizes her mistake. Relationship gurus tell you to communicate every emotion, even though oversharing kills attraction. Society encourages men to pedestalize women, even though pedestalizing is exactly what suffocates desire. And any man who becomes strong, stoic, or emotionally self-governing is instantly labeled toxic or emotionally unavailable. Why? Because an emotionally independent man cannot be manipulated, not by society, not by institutions, and certainly not by romance. When you become the man who doesn't beg, chase, or obsess, when you become the man who doesn't need validation, when you become the man who can walk away calmly, that's when you become dangerous. Not violent, not abusive. Dangerous because you cannot be controlled. And that is exactly the type of man modern society fears the most. So they teach you weakness while punishing your strength. They want you emotionally soft, so she never has to confront the reality that desire is earned, not owed. But once you see the strings, the illusions, the programming, you can't unsee it. And this realization leads directly into the next chapter, where everything starts to collapse. 6. The inevitable collapse. The emotional breaking point when the dynamic falls apart. There comes a moment in every man's life when the illusion finally cracks. Not because you chose it, not because you were ready, but because reality forces itself through the door you kept locked. It usually happens quietly. A shift in her tone, a drop in her excitement, a sudden distance you can feel but can't explain. And you try harder because that's what society trained you to do. More reassurance, more effort, more giving, more emotional exposure. But ironically, the harder you try, the faster everything collapses. Because effort cannot replace attraction. Compliance cannot create desire. And a man who sacrifices himself emotionally, hoping to save the connection, only speeds up his own downfall. This is the collapse. When she realizes she no longer fears losing you, and you realize you fear losing her more than you value yourself. Suddenly, her tests intensify, her coldness grows, her excuses multiply, and deep inside you feel it, that sinking fear that something is slipping away. But here's the cruel part. This collapse isn't caused by her. It's caused by the dynamic you were unknowingly trapped in. You became predictable, overinvested, emotionally exposed, and therefore emotionally safe. And that's when you stop being a mystery and become a burden. Every man remembers the moment he broke, that helpless feeling of watching the connection crumble while pretending everything is fine. This is the emotional destruction point, where the relationship dynamic cannot be saved because you are the one who must be rebuilt. And from this collapse comes the part every man avoids, but every man needs to face: the bitter truth. 7. The bitter truth. Harsh reality, but reframed into something psychologically accurate, not anti-women. Here's the truth, brother. The part that stings the most. The part every man eventually confronts when the dust settles. It was never really about her. It was about the version of yourself you became in the process. The man who stopped leading his own life. The man who abandoned his center. The man who thought emotional honesty meant emotional dependence. Women don't destroy men. Life does. Fear does. Attachment does. Expectations do. And the bitter truth is this: you weren't betrayed by a woman. You were betrayed by the belief that someone else was supposed to carry the weight of your identity. You thought love meant merging, but psychologically, a man collapses when he hands over the responsibility for his stability to another human being. Not because women can't handle it, but because no person can carry the emotional load you were trying to place on her. That weight was always meant for you. Here's what the collapse revealed. You stopped living with purpose. You stopped challenging yourself. You stopped being grounded. And the moment you lost yourself, you lost the dynamic too. The harsh reality is simple. The relationship didn't break you. Your unhealed patterns did. Your fear of abandonment did. Your overinvestment did. Your belief that love should save you did. And brother, this truth hurts because it's real. Because it forces you to face something you've avoided for years. You were living emotionally underfed and expecting connection to fill a void only self-respect can fill. This is the bitter truth. Not a condemnation, not a punishment, but a turning point. Because once you see this clearly, once you finally understand what really went wrong, you're no longer powerless. You're ready for the final stage, the awakening that rebuilds men from the inside out. 8. The Solution Framework. Brother, this is where everything changes. Because once you understand the emotional mechanism, you can rebuild yourself in a way that makes you untouchable. Not cold, not distant, but rooted. A man who is emotionally dangerous not because he harms women, but because he no longer collapses for them. Here is the framework, the shift that turns confusion into clarity and pain into power. 1. Reclaim your center. A man's power begins the moment he stops orbiting around other people. Psychologically, this is called self-governing emotional regulation, the ability to stabilize your own mind without seeking reassurance. This means you stop asking, is she pulling away? You stop wondering, did I do something wrong? You stop chasing validation like oxygen. You return to your baseline, your mission, your identity outside intimacy. When your center is internal, not external, no one can destabilize you. 2. Rebuild your value through action. Confidence doesn't come from affirmations. It comes from proof. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition, the dopamine reward loop. So you rebuild yourself through discipline, physical training, creative output, purpose-driven work, and measurable progress. Every small win rewires the brain. Every act of self-respect becomes a psychological anchor. You stop trying to impress her because you're too busy becoming a man you're proud of. 3. Embrace emotional stoicism. Stoicism is not emotional suppression. It is emotional management. You still feel everything. You just don't leak everything. This creates something women instinctively respond to. A man who is emotionally expressive, but not emotionally dependent. A man who can connect without collapsing. A man who can love deeply without losing himself. This balance is rare. This balance is dangerous. 4. Adopt the walk-away first philosophy. Not as a manipulation, but as a psychological boundary. You become willing to leave any situation where your peace is compromised. Because the man who is not afraid to walk away is the man who never gets walked over. This is detachment through strength, not apathy. It communicates a truth women subconsciously scan for. He chooses me, but he doesn't need me to function. That combination creates the respect, polarity, and attraction modern men keep losing. 5. Return to the self, full circle. The final step is the simplest. You live again. You reconnect with the man you were before heartbreak, before confusion, before the emotional fog. You rebuild your habits. You reestablish your standards. You rediscover your power. And here's the twist women never expect. When you no longer depend on anyone to stabilize your heart, you become the most magnetic version of yourself. Not because you're playing games, but because you're whole. This is what makes a man emotionally dangerous, not to women, but to the version of himself that once settled for less. Brother, once you reach this point, the game doesn't change. You do, and that changes everything.